subscribe, and hit like. Our powerful stories add years to your life. Join our Story Lovers Club and let us know in the comments, where are you listening from? What if every desperate choice you ever made was laid bare for the world to judge? Would they understand you or condemn you forever? This is not just a story. It's a raw wound, a question yelled into the darkness. What kind of mother could give up her own child? Many would answer with scorn, with shock, with damning certainty that only a monster could. But what if you could step into her shattered shoes, feel the ache that gnawed Amara from the inside, watch your entire world bleed out onto the street while life was supposed to be celebrating you? That's where our story begins, with pain, with hope, with a mother's hands trembling and bloody on wet asphalt. It wasn't just any night. The city outside the hospital thrummed with impatient horns, voices rising and falling in distant markets. While inside those sterile walls, a woman's body struggled to create two new lives. As Amara labored, pushing and sobbing, she clung to the hope that this agony would end with joy, a joy she'd begged the heavens for during 9 cursed years of barrenness. For almost a decade, her womb was the subject of gossip and ridicule, her worth measured by her ability, or inability, to bear children. Blood came each month like a funeral, and with it, another grave for a dream that withered before it could become flesh. Still, Amara bore it all. She held her head high, lips fixed in a smile that belied the thorns wrapped tight around her heart. Owena, her husband, the one anchor in her storm, was a man branded by loyalty. He chose Amara over the jeers and curses of his family, over his own mother's threats and brother's taunts, who told him to cast her aside and find a wife blessed with fertility. But he never flinched. "Love is patient," he'd whisper, holding her battered hope together as they prayed, fasted, tried holy water and hospital halls. Over the cracked paint of their rented home, Amara had carved Owena's words into her soul. God's time is the best time. Then the miracle came, a morning that began like any other, except this time, when Amara felt the wave of nausea rise in her gut, it didn't signal disappointment, but possibility. Owena, ever watchful, took her trembling hand and pressed it to her belly. It was just a flutter, but it grew into proof confirmed by a nurse who returned with trembling hands and a single word: positive. The words split their lives in two: a barren past, a fertile future. Owena dropped to his knees in a cocktail of laughter and tears. For a sliver of time, the curse was broken. Yet curses rarely lift without a price. The morning the twins came, the skies blackened, and the weight of all those years pressed down on Amara's body with unrelenting fury. Labor gripped her for hours. The shrieks that tore from her throat were born of both agony and defiance. Her world had shrunk to the pain, the hope for survival, and the ghost of Owena, who should have been beside her, holding her hand, breathing promises against her sweat and fear. But Owena was not there. He had left hours before, hurrying to fetch food, flowers, and the priest. Gifts for his wife, blessings for his sons. Time crawled and staggered. The nurse's voice shouted, "Push," and Amara obeyed, muscles ripped raw by hope and terror. 2 cries pierced the clinic's air, minutes apart. Her sons, living, breathing evidence, that miracles can happen, even if they feel tainted by sorrow. Amara willed her hands to reach out, to take them, even as her body faltered on the edge of collapse. "Where is he?" she asked, voice already trembling with premonition. No one met her eyes. One nurse turned away. Those tiny failures of honesty became the first cracks in her new world. It wasn't until hours later that the truth shattered her completely. OMONI would never hold his sons, never whisper their names, never walk through the hospital doors beaming with pride. News came in staccato pieces, a car, a junction, a flash of metal, and then nothing. OMONI was gone. Gone before his sons ever knew his face, just as their cries filled the air for the very first time. When Amara heard, she didn't scream. She didn't collapse into hysteria. Something inside her simply stopped moving. Her tears, her voice, her dreams. She clutched her newborns, tightening her grip as though she could anchor them to a world that was already proving how easily it could take everything away. Naming them now seemed senseless. What names have power to summon a father already beyond the reach of prayers? Even the soft pastels of the hospital became a prison's palette. Every wall closing in, every door leading nowhere. With OMONI gone, the world, a world that once seemed cruel but bearable, became indifferent, then hostile, then vengeful. She was now 2 sons. No husband, no family, and soon to be, it seemed, no home. In the coming weeks, the promises of laughter and fresh starts curdled into fear's bitter aftertaste. OMONI had been the pillar, the breadwinner, the reason why Amara and her unborn children would have a place in the world. His absence left more than grief behind. It left bills mounting with each day like stacked tombstones, reminders of everything they'd lost and everything they still owed. Hospitals don't make deals with widows and orphans. Bureaucracy doesn't bend for mothers whose milk will not come. For days and then weeks, Amara remained in her hospital bed. Every discharge form became a sentence she could not finish. Her sons, miracles, burdens, gifts, cried themselves to exhaustion while she watched guilt and despair eat away at her body. Other mothers arrived. Other babies took their first breaths and were wrapped tight in hope, only to disappear into the arms of fathers and grandmothers who came to claim them. Amara and her twins remained, almost invisible in their suffering. At night, when the ward fell silent and shadows lengthened across linoleum floors, she whispered over tiny foreheads, promising forgiveness for failures she could not fix. Her voice shivered as she chanted lullabies through cracked lips, prayers disguised as songs. Some nurses stared at her with pity that quickly soured to suspicion. Others whispered behind her torn curtain, "She's cursed, that one with the twins. She wanted her husband dead for sympathy. Now she wants to live here for free." Each word struck with the sharpness of a knife. But Amara had learned that pain finds new homes. It hollowed her breasts, stiffened her joints, iced over every memory of warmth from OMONI's embrace. The longer she stayed, the more she faded. Sleep became a battlefield of guilt and fear, food a memory, mercy a myth. Finally, the day came when her body could take no more humiliation and starvation. The hospital, eager to be rid of a charity case, left the gates open just before midnight. Amara became a shadow moving through rain-slick alleys, one baby strapped to her chest, the other lashed to her back, fleeing an institution that had never truly sheltered her. Behind her, indifference. Ahead, uncertainty. The night stung her bare skin, rain dissolving the few shreds of dignity she had left. Her stomach twisted with hunger. In truth, fear kept her feet moving long after her muscles had given up. Desperation chases like a predator. It drove Amara to the empty compound that had once been home, a place once filled with Owena's laughter and family gatherings. Darkness greeted her, the house padlocked. The word witch scrawled crimson across the walls, her meager belongings soaked and broken by the gutter, her wedding dress displayed like a warning to others. Even Ona's picture, bent and cracked, mocked her from the mud. A nearby window rattled open, just long enough for a neighbor to hiss, "Leave before worse finds you." Then she was alone again, remembered only by soaked debris. They said she'd conjured the twins through witchcraft, that she'd sacrificed Owena for their lives. Even pity now came wrapped in fear, third-hand warnings from neighbors who dared not get too close. Night after night, Amara and her children were rejected by locked doors and superstitious glances. Hunger consumed her from the inside out. Her once beautiful face grew hollow. Her babies, their cries growing weaker, bore witness to a mother's love twisted by survival into something nearly animal. True hunger is not just an emptiness of the stomach. It is the drying up of hope, the dissolution of dignity, the slow, invisible theft of all that once made you feel human. Amara scavenged through gutters and trash heaps, gagging as she swallowed bits of leftover bread to force it into her children's mouths. Leaves became food, rain became water, and every night became an eternity. She chewed bitter greenery, then spat it into her baby's lips, hoping that mimicked feedings would give them peace. Lessons bloom. But her breasts shriveled, milk dried by grief and malice. Each day, as they wandered, became a negotiation for one more hour. "Why carry demons?" someone spat as she passed. Another voice whispered curses, infectious with fear. She stopped answering, her voice gone from disuse, her thoughts reserved only for tiny ears pressed against her skin. She memorized the pitches of her son's wails: hunger, exhaustion, hopelessness. It became routine, this suffering. Her beauty melted away, her body transformed into a desperate shell of bones, her spirit shivering like wet laundry on a broken line. Yet still she moved. For their sake, if not her own, she found the strength to hawk water by roadsides, balancing cracked trays on her head, enduring humiliations that would have broken lesser souls. "Sell and bring my money," a market woman ordered, thrusting a sack of water at her. Amara nodded, learning to obey the world's new currency: humiliation for coin, shame for survival. With one baby on her back, the other on her chest, she wove through endless traffic, feet blistering and swollen, voice hoarse and ignored, heart enduring torment her mind could barely process. Lessons bloom. People usually had only two reactions: pity or disgust. Most gave only the latter. Those who spared some mercy often did so with a side glance and hurried steps. Still, Her determination wouldn't let her be swallowed by darkness. Not yet. The will to mother, to salvage at least one piece of hope, pressed Amara onward, even as the world turned away. Her skin stretched thin over bones, her baby's cries fainter with every sunrise. If grief can swallow whole the soul, poverty can grind it into dust. The marketplace was a living organism, pulsing with the shouts of vendors, the sharp smells of roasted peanuts and engine fumes, and the constant undercurrent of tension. Here Amara fought for each day, for each crumb and each coin, her twins tucked like fragile cargo against her worn body. The city barely noticed her, a shadow among countless others. Yet she felt the invisible chains of judgment as if they were physical. Some days brought the little mercy. A soft-hearted woman pressed an overripe banana into her palm, or a boy, no older than 10, dropped a single coin at her feet and fled before shame could catch him. But mostly, it was the relentless humiliation that marked her, the endless repetition of rejection, indifference, and outright malice. As the days blurred together, the twins' cries weakened. They grew listless, too tired to protest the world's neglect, their little fists uncurled as if surrendering. Amara watched each breath, terrified that pain would steal one, then both, from her. At night, when the marketplace's cacophony faded and only the hiss of distant tires punctuated the silence, fear haunted her. She wrapped her boys in scraps of cloth, scavenged from trash piles, singing the same refrains until sleep took them. Yet within her breast, the well of hope was drying. Each gesture, each desperate act was becoming automatic, mechanical, bereft of the joy that had once filled her. One particularly brutal afternoon, heavy rains turned the market into a river. The streets flooded with garbage, and vendors packed quickly, leaving Amara and her children exposed. She tried to shelter them beneath a sagging plastic tarp, but water broke through, soaking their thin clothing. A merchant pushed her aside. "Don't bring your misery here." She almost collapsed, hollowed by fatigue and humiliation. It was then, shivering, drenched, and watching her babies writhe in discomfort, that a thought invaded her mind, a thought so terrible she recoiled from it. But the seed was planted. There were ways to gain shelter, ways to buy safety, if only she could bear the cost. As dusk fell, a stranger approached, drawn by Amara's desperation, or perhaps her children's wide, pleading eyes. He offered her roasted yam in exchange for a moment of her pride. She accepted, swallowing her dignity with each bitter bite. The transaction was not just food. It was the slow erosion of her hope, bartering pieces of herself for their survival. In the shadows, Amara became less of a mother and more of an instrument, performing tasks she despised and mourning the loss of her true self. She survived, but each sunrise was razor thin between hope and despair. Sometimes mercy comes not from love, but from pity, and even then, it's a double-edged sword. The city had churches, mosques, scattered NGOs, and halfway houses, but access was guarded by gatekeepers whose hearts ranged from lukewarm to frosted shut. A pastor caught sight of Amara's trembling form and led her into the parish yard, promising bread and clean water. He asked probing questions about her husband, her children, her faith. But it became clear his help was temporary. A gift with strings, bundled with silent judgment. Other women in the shelter eyed Amara and her twins with suspicion. Some whispered tales about her. Did she kill her husband? Was she into witchcraft? Are those even her real children? Amara, used to the sting of gossip, kept her head down, cradling her sons in the corner, as prayers echoed from distant rooms. At night, she dreamed of Owena, of a home where laughter could drown out grief, but morning always returned her to the same bare cot, hunger gnawing louder with each sunrise. As weeks passed, the shelter manager grew impatient. The food rations were meager, and Amara's silence was mistaken for ingratitude. Not sure. The twins became ill, raw coughs scraping their throats, their bellies swelling in unnatural ways. Doctors appeared twice, muttered about nutrition, then left, sharing no comfort. Amara pleaded for medicine, for extra food, for a place to rest longer, but bureaucracy dictated that her time was up. The mothers who'd once sat beside her began to drift away. Spurred by silent rumors, she'd bring misfortune. The pastor's tone changed from gentle to sharp, warning her that staying would only attract more gossip, more trouble for everyone. Lessons bloom. So she packed up scraps of cloth, cradled her sons, and returned to the streets, now colder, more hostile than before. Her journey through supposed sanctuaries had taught her that even the kindest walls hid thorns. Pity and charity were never unconditional. Each refusal hardened her resolve. If she couldn't find an ally, she would have to become her own. Starvation changes a person, remaking them from the inside out. The city, having failed her, had predators who watched for the weakest, the most desperate. Amara learned this lesson late and painfully. As she sat beneath a flickering street lamp one evening, her twins bundled together for warmth, a wealthy-looking woman approached. Her name was Mrs. Khalifa, a businesswoman with sharp eyes and a reputation for solving problems. Mrs. Khalifa saw in Amara not only suffering, but also possibility. She stopped, kneeling close, inspecting the twins with a clinical detachment. "You're struggling," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "I have a place. You can work for me. Wash floors, carry water. Your sons will be safe. You'll eat." For a moment, hope flared. Maybe this was salvation, the answer Amara had begged for. She agreed quickly, swallowing the last shreds of hesitation. The mansion stood on the city's wealthy edge, its rooms bursting with the scent of citrus and polished wood, far removed from the decay of the marketplace. The twins stared wide-eyed, not yet old enough to process the shift, but sensing quiet. Amara worked tirelessly, days blurring into weeks, washing, carrying, scrubbing. She slept alongside her children on thin mats beside the servants' quarters. But at least they ate each night. Yet nothing is free in a world built on power and desperation. Mrs. Khalifa began treating Amara more like chattel than staff, denying her rest, berating her for the smallest mistake. The twins were sometimes forgotten for hours, their illnesses dismissed as childish fuss. When Amara pleaded for medicine or for a doctor, Mrs. Khalifa responded with icy impatience. "If they die, you'll have more time to work." It became clear then, the offer was not mercy, but exploitation. Amara wrestled with rage, shame, and the bone-deep exhaustion of a mother whose strength was being wrung for someone else's profit. Each night, after the mansion's lights dimmed, Amara found herself wrestling the twin monsters of guilt and grief. Owena's memory haunted her, a shadow that hovered by her son's mats, whispering accusations and questions she could not answer. Her twins, growing thinner, feverish, curled against her, sharing heat and shallow breaths. Alone in the dark, fear pressed tight against her chest. She prayed again, not for comfort, but for escape, for some act of fate to rescue her boys. One evening, as Amara scrubbed floors late into the night, Mrs. Khalifa appeared with a proposition that chilled the air. "You're wasting away," she said. "But you can't keep dragging those children here forever. Give them to me. I'll send them abroad. They'll have food, clothing, opportunity." The words dangled promises Amara was starved to believe, but they carried threats too, disguised in kindness. Amara hesitated, the world spinning around her. The choice felt impossible, cruel, a deal with the devil. Yet Mrs. Khalifa persisted, showing photographs of children rescued, lists of benefactors waiting to adopt. She pressed bundles of cash into Amara's palm. "You will eat. You will survive." That night, Amara wept beside her boys, her tears soaking their hair. She tried to imagine their lives, safe, fed, far away from hunger and accusation, in lands she could barely pronounce. Her soul rebelled, but reality whispered. Refusal meant death. Agreement meant loss. The pain was bottomless, but the need was absolute. By sunrise, she'd made her decision. She would not survive much longer, but maybe her sons could. On the appointed morning, the mansion was silent but for the rain tapping gently against windows. Amara dressed her sons in the cleanest clothes she could find, ragged but passable. Mrs. Khalifa had arranged everything. Cars would arrive, papers signed, twins sent away. Amara was to say goodbye, to hand away the only family she had left. She led the boys to the front room, each step a funeral march. She kissed their foreheads, whispered a blessing in Owena's native tongue, and fought to keep from crumbling in front of Mrs. Khalifa and her assistants. Her heart pounded, torn between the agony of surrender and the faintest flicker of hope for her son's future. They cried, sensing separation, clinging to her with the last of their strength. Amara shook, but held her ground, telling herself again and again, "This is what love demands." Outside, the cars waited. Papers were signed, and Amara was handed a bundle of cash, money that felt heavier than any burden she'd ever known. Her sons were lifted away, their cries muffled by the distance. Mrs. Khalifa nodded, already forgetting the ordeal as a matter completed. Amara remained, bowed, trembling. As night crept across the city once more, Amara found herself utterly alone. A mother without children, a widow without comfort, a ruined woman in a world more interested in judgment than mercy. But somewhere, deep within her battered soul, she felt the smallest spark, the hope that one day her sons might flourish, might forgive her, might remember a name that was once whispered in love. Nothing prepares a mother for the silence that pours into her life once her children are gone. Each day after the twins' departure crawled over Amara like a second death, the city's noise pressing indifferently outside her thin-walled room. The money Mrs. Khalifa had offered sat on the floor beside her, a fat envelope glowing in the darkness. But gold cannot fill the hollowness left behind by absent laughter, or warm the bedsheets still folded in her son's shapes. She tried, at first, to spend the money on acts that might numb her, wandering the markets, where bread and rice passed from hand to hand with no questions asked. Yet the shopkeeper's eyes lingered on her too long, as if they could see guilt reflected behind her pupils. She bought a thin mattress, clean water, soap that left her skin raw. She shared some notes with another struggling widow, forcing herself to remember what kindness looked like. Above all, she tried and failed to rest. But sleep would not come. In each shallow doze, she heard her boys calling, two little shadows, always just beyond the edge of her sight. She dreamed of Owena too, his voice re-emerging not as comfort, but as accusation. "Amara, what have you done?" he asked again and again. She clutched her stomach, wishing to carve out her regret, searching her empty hands for absolution. Night after night, Amara roamed the city's edges. She walked past churches, clinics, playgrounds packed with other people's children. Each sight was a blow. She called their names until her throat burned. Those who saw her averted their gaze. No one wanted the reminder of what abandonment looked like. Amara became the city's secret, a sorrow tucked behind whispered prayers and locked doors. Soon, even her own voice became unfamiliar. She had screamed her grief into the night, but the world had learned to sleep through the sound. The city that chewed Amara up did not forget her easily or forgive her. Rumor inched up and down the streets like a snake. The witch mother who sold her children. They said she had married Owena for his money, used magic to kill him, then exchanged her children for a heap of cash to escape her shame. Women spat as she passed, clutching babies tighter. Men shook their heads. Children mimicked the story in taunting games, singing mocking songs, reenacting a mother tossing babies to wolves. Amara had become more than a person. She was now a warning, a living lesson about pride, ambition, and misfortune. There was no sanctuary. When she lingered near the mosque, even the imam looked away. The pastor who once prayed over her chased her from the church steps, voice hard with disgust. The marketplace, once a place of grinding work and uneasy community, became a gauntlet of boycotted vendors and cold shoulders. Yet what cut deepest was the betrayal of those she once loved. Owena's family, their faces, once familiar and warm during festivals, now glared at her with unconcealed hatred. They demanded back every wedding gift, every borrowed cloth, even threatened the authorities. The police were willing enough to harass, shoving her along, reminding her that women like you never last long. Each day the world shrank a bit more, hope flickering, then dying in corners she'd once called home. But Amara would not leave. Not yet. Even as a pariah, her feet found their way each evening to the schoolyard fence, where she stared in hope, her eyes searching the crowd for faces that matched the memory of her twins. Was this madness or mercy? She didn't know. Clutching a worn toy in her pocket, a soft blue elephant, she prayed that somewhere, someone was gentler to her boys than this city had ever been to their mother. A mother's memory is elastic, jolted by hope and terror for the ones she can no longer touch. Amara conjured images of her sons' new lives, both as comfort and as torment. She pictured them in unknown homes, perhaps in another country, or the grand house of a distant patron. She imagined the good, clean beds, new toys, warmth, and the chance to forget starvation. But the shadows crept in, strange languages, indifferent faces, perhaps worse hands than Mrs. Khalifa's. She pieced together scraps of rumor about kidnappings and orphanages, about benevolent traffickers. It terrified her, knowing she would never know for sure if her boys had gone to honest, loving families or into a new kind of cage. Still, in the destroyed quiet of her heart, she kept the small altar of belief that things would be different. That if the gods were merciful at all, at least one would grow up strong and free. Sometimes she allowed herself to dream they'd remember her. She hummed the lullabies she once sang at dusk, gazing toward the sky with salt in her eyes. Would they recall that song if it drifted across the ocean? Would they use her name when they stumbled? Or would another language bury it? Pain and hope waxed and waned within her, in a cycle as relentless as breath. And always, below the surface, a different dread. If she survived, if she ever found them again, would her sons hate her for what she had done? Or in some impossible future, would they understand that desperation warps love beyond recognition? And sometimes, love's only proof is the scar it leaves behind. Exhaustion blurred the lines between waking and sleep. Amara began to see visions. She could not decide if they were Owena's ghost, her own splintered sanity, or something else more ancient and kind. Some nights he came to her as he had been in life, proud and smiling, arms wide for her and their children. He forgave her, standing among a garden of impossible green, voice a balm over her wounds. You tried, Amara. You did more than anyone could have expected. Rest now. Other nights he accused. Blood dripped from his lips. His gaze turned sharp and cold. They are gone because you let them go, he whispered. Because you chose yourself, not us. Amara clung to the edge of her bed, humming lullabies, rocking her own emptiness, until dawn bled along the horizon. Through it all, she continued routine acts of survival, fetching water, cleaning houses when anyone would risk hiring her, submitting to the city's sharpening contempt. Her dreams felt more real than the world itself. Sometimes she chose to sleep longer, seeking peace among imagined faces of forgiveness. But every morning, there were no arms waiting, just the whimper of stray dogs, the clang of market bells, and the ache that filled the space where love once grew. In the funerary silence of dawn, Amara found herself praying, not for her own salvation, but that her sons might never remember the cost of their freedom. Days turned to months, months thickened into years. Still, time would not let Amara forget, though it did everything to push her forward. The city changed. Buildings were painted, people moved away, children grew up with new rumors and fresh tragedies to titter about. But Amara remained, older, battered, thinner, but still present, like an unwanted stain on the city's conscience. She survived by habit, clutching whatever tiny dignity she could find in a world that remembered only her crime. Occasionally, she saw families celebrate in clumps around the park, heard snatches of song that reminded her of a time when she had dared to dream she belonged among them. Sometimes she caught herself reaching instinctively for the hands that once clung to her skirts, and the emptiness that followed was as sharp as when she'd first stepped outside the hospital walls, alone. Yet life, in its perversity, does not always punish forever. With every year, the fire of judgment in people's eyes faded. The stories lingered. Who could forget so thoroughly? But the faces changed, wounds dulled into scars. Amara aged, becoming less a cautionary tale, more a quiet curiosity. She took work where she could, spent her evenings by the same playgrounds, her heart always aching for the sound of familiar laughter. Behind her silence grew a kind of wisdom. She began to help others, other women flung out by grief or misfortune, other mothers accused or abandoned. She never spoke of her pain directly, but her actions offered comfort. Perhaps it was mercy, perhaps the city's, perhaps God's, that she could now minister in some small way to wounds like her own. One damp evening, as Amara made her way back from the marketplace, she noticed a commotion near the compound gate where she now inhabited a makeshift room. A young man, well-dressed but nervous, stood uncertainly among the neighbors, holding an envelope stamped with an unfamiliar foreign seal. Amara nearly passed him by, but the crowd parted, and someone pointed. "She's the one you want," they said, their tones laced with both curiosity and old suspicion. He approached her, introduced himself in careful English, then switched to Amara's language with a respectful nod. "I have a letter for you. It's from abroad." The envelope bore names she hadn't uttered in years, her sons, written in slanted, deliberate script. Her knees nearly buckled at the sight. Later, behind the thin curtain of her room, Amara opened the letter with trembling hands. Inside, in halting but unmistakable words, her sons wrote of their lives in a distant country. New names, new caregivers, schooling, strange foods. Languages that still twisted on their tongues. One confessed to crying for her at night. Another described a recurring dream in which Amara sang him back to sleep. They asked if she was alive, if she still remembered them, if Oena had ever told her how to tie a necktie, for school required one each day. The words were both gift and torment. Amara's heart surged with joy. Her boys were alive, learning, searching for pieces of themselves, their longing a bridge stretched across continents. But the pain returned, sharper than ever before, for she had no way of answering, no address but a memory, no means to hold them, but the hope that her love was still alive in their dreams. She wept for hours, clutching the letter like a holy relic, her grief now gilded with pride. The letter changed everything and nothing. It did not erase the years of exile, nor soften the neighbor's long-standing suspicion. But a new energy arose in Amara, purpose flickering to life alongside her sorrow. She began to tell pieces of her story to the few who would listen, not in apology, but as warning and promise. Other women, once wary, now listened more closely, whispered their own tragedies, asked for her wisdom on surviving, with nothing but hope and bare hands. Gradually, Amara carved out a place for herself. She worked in a small tailoring shop, mending uniforms and stitching cheap dresses. With every careful seam, she remembered her boy's clothes, how once she had stitched hopes and wishes into every pocket. Sometimes the local children brought her more mending and lingered, drawn to her gentle hands and the faint lilt of lullabies that drifted from her lips when she worked alone. She became, without intention, a quiet guardian for the neighborhood's orphans and abandoned children. Her pain granted her a patience and resilience few could match. She taught children to read beneath a splintered mango tree, swapped folk stories, and held them close when their own mothers could not. Her home, a narrow rented room at the edge of the compound, became a sanctuary for the grieving and hopeful alike. Amara's faith, once marked only by loss, now reflected traces of something else, strength hard-won, and a goodness forged by the crucible of survival. Her sons remained far away, but her mother's heart began to pulse with a steadier, quieter strength, one that would outlast even the longest, hardest years. Ritual had always anchored Amara, but now her private ceremonies became lifelines. Each evening, she lit a candle by her son's letter, speaking prayers to ancestors, to Ona, to the unknowable future. She whispered their names as if calling down a blessing, sending love and forgiveness across land and sea. She lit incense when she could afford it and stitched their initials in the lining of her dress, a small, secret rebellion against the world's forgetting. Neighbors sometimes peered into her room at night, hearing her low songs or catching the rhythm of rocking. Some called her a witch again, but she ignored them now. She knew her rituals kept her sane, weaving shattered years into something like meaning. When storms battered the city, she found extra candles to burn, imagining her boys needed light wherever they slept. When the harmattan winds whipped grit through her window, she told herself it was their laughter riding on the breeze. She began to write them letters she could not send, filling notebook after notebook with stories, confessions, and advice she hoped they'd need someday. In them, she told the truth, the unbearable, the beautiful, and the merely mundane. She also wrote apologies, never to ask for pity, but to let her sons know that in every dark choice, love was what had driven her hand. One day, she dreamed that both sons came home, taller than their father, bringing her mangoes and milk, and together they laughed all day. She awoke crying, but no longer empty. Years sculpted Amara's pain into something stronger, an almost radical forgiveness, She forgave Owina's family for their hatred, for blaming her grief on curses rather than misfortune. She forgave the nurses and doctors who turned away, unable or unwilling to bear her suffering. She even forgave Mrs. Khalifa, whose hunger for power had spelled the final separation. None of these came easily, but she discovered that forgiveness was not for the world's benefit. It was her own final act of survival. By letting go, she could gather her scattered pieces and stitch herself back together. The sting of public shame eased. Now, neighbors came to her first when tragedy struck, trusting her quietness and the wisdom that sorrow had earned. In time, even the harshest gossips softened. People marveled at her patience with children, the way she responded to cruelty not with bitterness, but with calm, enough to unsettle even her harshest critics. Amara built a new family among the forgotten, her love deepening, not shrinking, in the absence of her boys. And though late at night she still ached, still wondered where her sons' journeys had taken them, she began to hope secretly that they would someday forgive her too. Her mothers came with their daughters, grandmothers with new orphans, sometimes just to sit and listen to the woman who had outlived the worst shame a village could imagine. Amara brewed weak tea with whatever she could afford, and shared stories beneath the mango tree. Some women cried for the first time in years. Others learned to laugh again, safe among those who understood pain. For the city, the gathering of broken women was an oddity. For the women, it was community. They began pooling their money to buy needles and thread. Together they made quilts, patchworks of bright, clashing colors. Each piece held stories stitched among the lines: loss, survival, the quiet promise of new days. The quilts sold at the market, enough to buy more rice, more soap, more thread. Amara spoke little about her past, but in the rhythm of her sewing and the warmth of her smile, she taught them resilience. Those who once feared her now held her in warm respect, some even calling her Mama Amara when their own mothers could not answer. In the company of these women, Amara's heart began to mend, not because her story was forgotten, but because it was finally understood.